I will begin my presentation with these two quotations, which most of you are probably very familiar with. And in particular, I think the second quotation about from Lord Byron about the life of the hermit on Mount Athos is something that probably a lot of you have read or seen at some point. And that's really the heart of what I'm going to talk about today, this idealization of the hermit and the relationship between hermits and communal monasteries, a connovion. So one of the defining characteristics of Orthodox Christian monasticism is its rich diversity of gradations of solitary and communal life. And nowhere is this fact more evident than within the monastic republic of Mount Athos. Both today and throughout its history, Athos has housed communities of monks, ranging from the grand communal monasteries, the Kinovia, such as Lavra, Batopeti, and Eviron, to smaller ones, skeets, with only a few inhabitants, all the way down to the solitary hermit inhabiting a simple hut or cave. This richness of forms of monastic life, which at present seems a balanced and well-thought-out system, is in fact the result of centuries of experimentation, conflicts, and compromises. With the topic of our present gathering, namely Holy Mountains, Holy Men, the spirituality of Mount Athos, this morning I would like to explore the question of communal monasticism on the Holy Mountain with regard to the person who served as its greatest exponent, Saint Athanasios the Athonite. Though often credited with introducing communal monasticism on Mount Athos and thereby transforming Athonite monasticism from what had been a scene dominated by hermits into a landscape formed above all by the large communal monasteries, Athanasius' own attitudes towards the best form of monasticism are not as easy to discern as one might suppose. So before starting with an attempt to answer the question of the relationship between Athanasius and communal monasticism, it is worth summarizing some of the main scholarly views on his life and activity, and I'll be very brief here, so no worries. There is now a not insignificant amount of scholarship on his person, and here I will merely offer some of the more important recent evaluations. Among the most influential older views of Athanasius is that of the scholar Julien Leroy, who over 60 years ago posited that Athanasius had undergone a so-called conversion experience, whereby he renounced the strict eremitic leanings that had characterized his early years and learned to embrace the ideal of communal monasticism. Leroy's theory was proposed at a time when most researchers assumed that Byzantine monasticism, despite some aberrations, had largely followed the medieval West in adopting communal monasticism, especially from the time of Theodore the Studite. Scholarship on Byzantine monasticism in the last few decades, however, has come to rather different conclusions about how monastic life was organized in the Byzantine world. And this is indicated, for instance, by a recent monograph of Alice Mary Talbot on varieties of monastic experience in Byzantium. Talbot emphasizes the numerous gradations of monastic life between the lone hermit and the great connovion. And although Leroy might have been correct in postulating that later in life, Athanasius might have turned more towards the model of large Studite monasteries for the inspiration of organizing his own community on Athos, the larger premise behind his thesis that communal monasticism on a broader level somehow won out over the eremitic life in Byzantium is no longer tenable. The piece of scholarship of greatest relevance to my talk this morning is a study of the recently deceased Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, who wrote an important examination of the question of Athanasius of Athos as an innovator in Byzantine monasticism in the year 1996. Kallistos argued that Athanasius was in fact not so much of an innovator, with his Lavra being more or less a Studite-style connovion, as traditionally has been thought. The one area where Athanasius did innovate, so his argumentation, was regarding a limited degree of eremitic life that was permitted in Lavra, which was not a feature of Studite monasticism. So it is above all, with the study of these previous scholars in mind, that I would like to now examine Athanasius as a proponent of communal monasticism. And in doing so, my talk will be divided into three sections. First, I will offer a brief overview of Mount Athos and Byzantine monasticism before the arrival of Athanasius, particularly with regard to its form of communal life. Second, for the main part of my talk, I will discuss Athanasius and his ideas about the best form of monastic life. And last but not least, I will then briefly examine the debates about Athanasius' legacy as a champion of communal monasticism on Mount Athos. So before describing the Holy Mountain on the eve of Athanasius' arrival, it is worth defining a few terms. Already in this talk, I have repeatedly mentioned words like communal and eremitic monasticism. What exactly do I mean? Christian monasticism has throughout its existence known various degrees of communal life. The first type of monasticism was that of the solitary hermit, whose prototype was Anthony the Great, as recounted in his Vita by Athanasius of Alexandria. In this idealized portrait of monastic life, hermits were the athletes of the desert, men who willingly embraced hunger, exposure to the elements, and the danger posed by the bandits and wild beasts in pursuit of ascetic excellence. Even though already in Anthony's day, hermits had assembled into larger communities, the eremitic ideal remained a figure who labored in near total isolation. The hermit was responsible for his own maintenance and upkeep, which he earned either from the alms of believers or, probably more commonly, from his own handicrafts and manual labor. So this is one image, of course, the most popular image of the hermit that we have, the hero of the desert. When trying to imagine the life of medieval hermits, we should, however, be cognizant that alongside these hero-like figures, like Anthony and other saints depicted in Saints' Life, there were also hermits of a more prosaic variety. Through the Egyptian papyri in particular, we know of hermits who conducted quite normal property transactions and maintained contact with the lay world. Moreover, excavation of Egyptian hermitages has revealed that some hermitages were not mere huts or caves, but rather more like comfortable country houses. Not quite as grand as this, but nonetheless nice. And I'll show you an example in a moment. So this is an example of a monastic testament from Egypt. We don't know exactly when, 500 to 800. And this is a monk who had 3 children. One of them had been deceased. And this is his testament, which is dividing up his property among these kids. And he maintained contact with the lay world, and his children seem to have visited him on a regular basis. And this type of evidence from Egypt is not uncommon. And then if we're trying to imagine what a hermitage might have looked like, this is a very nice example from a Polish scholar, Ewa Wipszycka, who has examined a lot of the archaeological excavations of hermitages in Egypt. And this is a reconstruction of what a larger hermitage might have looked like. So as you can see, it's not one house or hut, but rather it's more of a complex. And rather than a single person, a single hermit living in such a hermitage, we might imagine, say, 2 or 3 hermits living together. So an elder, perhaps 1 or 2 disciples would have been the most common sort of form we have. So the growing size of these ascetic communities eventually resulted in attempts at a more centrally organized form of monastic life, which is termed communal or cenobitic monasticism. The invention of the communal monastery also occurred in Egypt and is traditionally ascribed to one Pachomius, a former Roman soldier turned monk. With the cenobion emerged many of the key features that most of us probably associate with monasticism: the subordination of the community to the authority of the abbot, communal dining and worship, and individual poverty for the sake of collective ownership. Now, so we have these 2 forms of monastic life at, say, 2 ends of a spectrum. But there was a 3rd form that we should also mention that was developed then in late antique Palestine and popularized above all by Savas, by Mar Saba. And this was the so-called Lavra. And with Lavra you have a mix of these 2 forms I've already mentioned, in that the monks live basically as hermits during the week, and then on the weekends they come together to celebrate the divine liturgy and perform communal tasks. And you can see, I have a picture here of Mar Saba, which still exists today. And this was a model, as we'll see, very much a model for the Byzantine monks I'll be talking about in a few moments. So, having outlined the 3 main forms of monastic life in the Byzantine context, let us now come to the question of which of these forms was practiced on Mount Athos, especially around the time of Athanasius' arrival on the Holy Mountain, probably in late 957 or early 958. It is important to emphasize that we have no evidence for permanent human settlement on Athos from antiquity until the first indications of monastic life there in the 9th century. While the peninsula was traversed by shepherds or hunters for short periods of time during the year, there were no villages or homesteads, to say nothing of more permanent monastic settlements. We heard yesterday, unfortunately I missed the talk because my flight was delayed, for which I apologize. We heard yesterday in Rosemary Morris's presentation about the origins of the early Athonite monks, so that I need not recapitulate her remarks here. Nevertheless, I would like to emphasize one important point, which, as we shall see, is relevant to the story of Athanasius and his relationship to communal monasticism. The supposed first Athonite monk, Peter the Athonite, who purportedly lived from the second half to around the middle of the 9th century, was reputed to have lived as a solitary hermit upon the Holy Mountain for 5 decades, actually 53 years. The details of Peter's life and to what degree they corresponded to facts on the ground on the Holy Mountain in the 9th century are rather less important than why Peter's legend became popular in the late 10th century and its articulation. And I'll return to this topic of the legendary first monk of Mount Athos later in my talk. But first of all, let's move to this description of what Athos was like when Athanasius arrived there. And this is a rather long citation, but I think it's worth reading in full to give you an idea of what life on Mount Athos was imagined to be before Athanasius arrived. So, crossing over to him, to Athos, due to him of old, he walked about on the mountain and wandered all around. Observing the multitude of monks who were practicing asceticism there and investigating their very harsh way of life and their solitary existence free from distractions, Athanasius marveled and rejoiced and was spiritually edified to encounter such men and such freedom and conditions as he had yearned for even before. For those good fathers did not engage in agricultural work, nor were they entangled in business affairs, nor were they distracted by bodily concerns. Nor did they own a beast of burden, nor an ass, nor a dog, but constructed huts of wild grasses and lived in the summer and winter, scorched by the sun and frozen by the cold. If they ever needed to transport something somewhere, they did this themselves. They would place pads on their shoulders and carrying the object would transport it wherever they wished. Their food was nuts and the fruit of other trees. If ever people came by ship from somewhere to anchor at the mountain for the sake of a blessing, as some often used to do, then the monks would take wheat or millet from the visitors or some other kind of grain, and in return would provide them with fruit. This would not happen without precautions or frequently, but with due deliberation and careful observation on account of the attacks of the most godless Cretans, which used to occur in the old days, where they would lurk in rocky inlets and rob passers-by and murder monks on the mountain. So, as you can see here, we have a rather idealized picture of what Mount Athos was like when Athanasius arrived. These monks are completely free from worldly cares. They sort of live off the land. They are occasionally visited by maybe what we would call pilgrims to receive blessings, but they don't even have livestock. So we have this very interesting image here of when they need to move larger loads of cargo, they would actually put pads on their shoulders and basically act as beasts of burden. So we have this very, yes, you could say idealized portrait of what life there was like. And if you read this passage, you can understand why scholars in the past have come to the conclusion that Athanasius was truly a transformative figure. So before Athanasius came, there were hermits on Mount Athos, Athanasius comes, and then everything changes. And I've chosen this idea of sort of Athos being a hermit kingdom before Athanasius came. However, unfortunately, this is a misleading idea, and scholars have really started to emphasize this in the last few decades. And one name to mention here, we have Rosemary Morris in the room, but also the French scholar named Michel Kaplan has examined a lot of these early settlements on Athos and come to the conclusion that actually we have evidence for quite a few communal monasteries before or around the time of Athanasius' coming. I'll just mention a few of them here. There's an institution called the Monastery of Athos, the Mount Athos. We have Seropotamo. We have two other institutions, including Zebu, which I'll come to later. So we have at least 4 cenovia, or 4 monasteries of some sort, which are already active either on Athos or sort of on the borders of Mount Athos at around the time of Athanasius' arrival. So in fact, there were already communal monasteries, not as grand, of course, as the Great Lavra would become, but there was some sort of communal monastic life on Athos before Athanasius' arrival. And I think this is important to keep in mind because this mixed form of, this mixed model of different forms of monastic life, which we find elsewhere in the Byzantine world, was probably already there in some shape on Athos before Athanasius arrived. But now let's focus on the topic of today's talk. Let's focus on Athanasius. And for most of you, this is probably already well known, but I'll just give a few facts about his early life before coming to Athos. So Athanasius was probably born between 925 and 930 in Trebizond, to a father from Syrian Antioch and a mother from Lazica, from western Georgia. His baptismal name was Abraham, even though now, of course, we know him better by his monastic name of Athanasius. His childhood in Trebizond was marked by loss, as his parents died at a young age, and he was therefore orphaned. However, despite this tragedy, he still managed to attain good schooling in Trebizond. And by the way, Trebizond so is on the southern coast of the Black Sea, what is today northern Turkey. Again, you probably all know that, but I'll just point that out. Rather far away from Athos, by the way, about 1,300 kilometers as the bird flies between Athos and Trebizond. So Athanasius nonetheless managed to get a very good education. He's brought to Constantinople and receives sort of the higher form of Byzantine education, and proves to be such a good student that he soon becomes a tutor of students himself. So Athanasius, if he were alive today, he probably would have been so talented that he would have come to some place like Cambridge or Oxford or something like that. He was an excellent student. And in fact, in the documents we have from Athos where Athanasius has signed, you can see that his signature is actually a very beautiful signature and less unlearned than some of the other monk signatures that we have. So he obviously stands out. So how did Athanasius become a monk? He might have very well stayed in the capital and pursued this teaching career, which he appears to have been very good at. But Athanasius happened to meet a very charismatic monastic figure named Michael Malainos. And Michael is a key figure in our story, so I will go into some detail about who he was. Michael stemmed from a powerful Byzantine family, so he's a member of the elite. And instead of pursuing a career in the army or the bureaucracy, he decided at the age of 18 to basically run away from home against the wishes of his parents and to become a monk. And what he ended up doing is he founds a lavra on the monastic center of Mount Athos in Western Asia Minor. And probably in the year 952, Athanasius follows Michael back to his monastery, was tonsured there, and over the next 5 to 6 years received basically his monastic training on Mount Athos in Western Asia Minor, close to modern-day Bursa. And he stayed there until 957 or 958 when he left for Athos. So let's talk a little bit about, because this is very important, I think, for the type of monasticism that Athanasius himself was a proponent of. What sort of monasticism was practiced at this lavra of Michael Malainos? Unfortunately, we know very little about Mount Athos and about this lavra. And basically, almost all of our information comes from Michael's vita. So what can we say about Michael? So Michael, as I said, he became a monk at age 18 and stayed a monk until his death. And he practiced different forms of ascetic life throughout his career. So first, he served in a probably communal monastery of his spiritual mentor, one John Eretitis. And this spiritual mentor, John, eventually gave Michael permission to live as an anchorite on a large cliff in the vicinity of the monastery. And Michael would spend 5 days a week on this cliff, and he would come down on Saturday and Sunday to celebrate the Divine Liturgy with his community. Eventually, Michael left this community entirely with a relative, one Agapios, And they tried to pursue greater isolation in basically northwestern, what is now northwestern Turkey. And eventually they came to the mountains around Bursa, and Michael set up a hut, a kalifi, for himself. However, Michael, like Athanasius later, was such a charismatic and impressive individual that his fame spread far and wide, and eventually 50 monks settled in a community around him. And as Byzantine saints often do in such situations, Michael didn't want all of this fame and renown. He left this community, and he founded a new monastery, and this was, in the end, this Lavra that we're talking about with Athanasius. And his Vita says that, actually he uses some very interesting terminology to describe the foundation of this Lavra. He says that he made the desert a city, which is something we find in a lot of the Desert Fathers, polisas tin erimon. The Vita also notes that he acted as a lawgiver in the style of a new Moses, so setting out rules for his monastic community. And in short, what we have with Michael, and what we know about monastic life at this Lavra, at Mount Athos, was that, again, it's sort of a mixed, it offers a mixture of monastic forms of living together. So it's a Lavra. Some monks are living in cells during the week and coming together on the weekend. If you are a very advanced monk, you can live as a hermit. And there is, at its core, also a communal congregation at the monastery itself. So what does Athanasius do when he's on Mount Athos? Well, we learn from Athanasius' lives. By the way, there are 3 lives that we know of, A and B, and there's an earlier life, C, which was discovered a few decades ago on Mount Sinai in St. Catherine's Monastery. But most of the information I'm telling you comes from this second version, this this B version of the life. So Athanasius, he was inclined to asceticism. He wanted to wear a hair shirt. He wanted to sleep on a chair and eat only 1 day a week. And basically what the life goes through is that Michael recognized the enthusiasm of Athanasius for the ascetic life, but he tried to restrain him, basically. So don't eat 1 day a week, eat 2 days a week, don't sleep on a chair, sleep on a bench in the church, that sort of thing. So what we see here is a model for what would later be used for the founding of the Great Lavra. And another just important aspect I'd like to mention about this time that Athanasius spent on Mount Athos is that he took another thing from his mentor Michael, which was the importance of good political connections. And this is, sorry, I'll go back to the last slide because this is important here. Michael was related by marriage to the Phocas family, and they were one of the most important aristocratic clans in the Byzantine Empire, and his nephews were the successful generals Leo and Nicephorus Phocas, both of whom came into contact with Athanasius through the mediation of Michael. Michael actually encouraged his nephews to accept Athanasius as their confessor, basically, as their spiritual father. And during a visit to Mount Athos, Nicephorus Phocas, the future emperor, even expressed his desire to become a monk and to live under Athanasius' tutelage, which will become important later in our story. So, because of this favor that Athanasius had received from his spiritual mentor, Michael, the other monks wanted to honor him as a successor in waiting. But Athanasius didn't actually want this. Again, this desire to escape renown is a common topos or theme in Byzantine hagiography. So Athanasius actually leaves Mount Athos and he goes to Mount Athos. And initially when he goes there, in order to stay under this cloud of anonymity, he adopts a pseudonym, so he calls himself Barnabas. And he lives in a monastery called Ziku, which has been archaeologically investigated, by the way, and here are 2 pictures of what this monastery might have looked like. So we have actually a very beautiful mosaic floor here, and it must have been an important monastery in its own time. But, and it's currently, by the way, it's actually part of the Athonite tradition that anyone can visit, since it's just on the other side of the border between Mount Athos and sort of the lay world. So if you're ever in northern Greece or around Athos, I would very much recommend going to see this archaeological site. And it's open, you can just walk around and take a look at sort of thing. They had a wine press and other things that are sort of interesting to see. So this is where Athanasius ends up. He is he's living under the pseudonym of Barnabas, and he lives with an elderly hermit in a cell outside of Zebu monastery. Eventually, over the course of time, Athanasius can't hide the fact that he is not only spiritually and aesthetically very gifted, but also that he's very well educated. And eventually, there's a portion in the life where they find out that Athanasius, who had been pretending to be illiterate, can not only read, but can also read at a very high level, very beautiful Greek. And so the monks figure out that Athanasius is Athanasius, and the story continues from there, that Nicephorus Phocas, who's a general, is sent to Crete to basically reconquer it for the Byzantine Empire. And Nicephorus, when he's campaigning there, he requests Athanasius' presence along with 2 or 3 other fathers in order to pray for the victory of the Byzantine army. Athanasius didn't want to do this, but the Athonites, recognizing that Nicephorus is an important person and saying no would be a bad sign, convinced Athanasius to go to Crete. And so he goes there. And while he's on Crete, and we have this in the life, a very interesting promise, Nicephorus makes good on this earlier idea of becoming a monk and says that he actually wants to found a new community with Athanasius. And this is the citation here on the slide. "The time has come for which I have long been yearning to flee the affairs of this world. All we need to do now is to build a place for us to live. So I beg your holiness, first of all, to build us cells in which to pursue spiritual tranquility, and a church, and fit it out for a cenobitic community. There, you and I, together with 3 other brethren, may live the solitary life in cells designed for the pursuit of spiritual tranquility. But on Sundays, we may come together to Lavra to partake of the divine sacraments and eat together with the brethren and the superior and leave again." And after the conquest of Crete, Athanasius goes back to Athos to begin the construction of the monastery. And as you can probably see here, what Nicephorus is basically describing here is not a kenovion, but a lavra. So monks live in cells during the week, and they come together on the weekend. So once Athanasius returns to Athos, things quickly get going. He builds a large complex, which included, according to the hagiographer, not only a church with 2 chapels, but also an infirmary/hospital, a guest house, and a bathhouse. He constructs an aqueduct, so on and so forth. So we have a phase here of intense building, which is being funded by money from Nicephorus Phocas and the Phocas family. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but Lavra becomes a very successful monastery, and a very large one, very quickly. Now, Nicephorus is successful in this campaign on Crete. He reconquers Crete. And not only that, he also becomes emperor in 963, which is a big problem because as emperor, he can no longer become a monk, right? And they sort of have a conflict, Athanasius and Nicephorus. Athanasius tries to flee Athos. I'm not going to go into all the details of the story, but they basically reconcile. And as part of this reconciliation, the money, the yearly amount of money that's going to the Lavra increases drastically. So now the growth of Lavra is really picking up. But now I want to talk about Nicephorus a bit, and sort of the ideology behind the type of monastery he wants to found. And it's going back to this idea of what's a Lavra. Because from all we can tell, Nicephorus, and probably through the influence of his uncle, Michael Melainos, had a very specific idea of what monastery should be like. And we get one idea of this through his novel, which famously restricts the foundation of new religious institutions. And in this novel, for instance, we have this quote about monastic creeds. So Nicephorus writes, and this is the first quotation, he criticizes the hours upon hours that they, monks, hasten to acquire thousands of acres of land, lavish buildings, herds of horses, cattle, camels, and other beasts beyond counting, stretching the whole concern of their soul to embrace these things, with the result that monastic practices are in no way different from worldly life, bloated with care, unquote. And in this novel, he restricts the foundation of new monasteries. So you're not allowed to found new monasteries or actually new religious institutions in general. Instead, you should refound existing institutions or supply them with additional resources. But he makes an important exception. In the novel, you are allowed to found new monasteries if they are a lavra or kilia, cells, in deserted places. So you can see already that Nicephorus and this sort of school of monks around him has a very specific idea of the good type of monasticism that should be practiced. Now, when we look at also how Nicephorus patronized monastic institutions that he supported, it's very clear that another important aspect is that they're not supplied with land. So this criticism of having too much, and they above quote, thousands of acres of land, lavish buildings, herds of horses, etc. This is something that Nicephorus wanted to avoid with his patronage, and he did that, apparently, by supplying communities via annual payments, annuities. And we learned this actually from the Typicon of Athanasios the Athonite, quote, driven by this holy zeal, he, Nicephorus, incessantly established ascetic dwellings on Mount Athos and settled monks in them. He generously provided for their needs, in part from his own fortune, and in part by interceding with the emperors at the time. He managed to offer yearly subsidies to them, and most eagerly honored them with the creation and granting of annuities, solemnia. Moreover, he furnished these very same benefactions also to the monks at Mount Olympus. So, what we have here is a very specific type of monasticism that's actually very different from what we know, for instance, from the medieval West, where the standard model is when you found a new monastery, you give it a landed endowment, you give it landed estates. Here, it's important that that a lavra or a kilion not have land or try to avoid landowning because that seems to have been spiritually harmful. So the lavra is developing apace. It seems as though Athanasius has really transformed the economy of the Holy Mountain, even during his own lifetime. And after the death of his imperial patron in 969, Nicephorus is actually murdered. There is an attempt, a sort of coup attempt on the Holy Mountain by monks who were opposed to Athanasius, who tried to turn back to the old regime before he came. And this is described in some detail in the Vita. Here's the passage. The devil moved the Haggarite elders to action by claiming that the saint, Athanasius, had erected luxurious buildings and had constructed churches and harbors and channeled streams of water and bought teams of oxen and already transformed the mountain into a worldly place. He had returned a holy place into the cosmos, into the world again. And of course, from the monastic point of view, that's bad. You have a conflict then that's settled by the new emperor, John Tzimiskis, in 971-972, and this is the Typicon that settles this dispute and basically tries to regulate these different types of monastic life on Athos, both communal monasticism and the eremitic life. And you can, it would be simplistic to say one side won and the other didn't, but basically Athanasius managed to retain the privileges of the Lavra on the Holy Mountain. I will now come briefly to the third part of my talk, which is the legacy of Athanasius, and how this debate continued in the decades after his death about what is the best form of monasticism. The subsequent history of the Holy Mountain, which saw the founding of Lavra-like large cenobitic institutions like Vatopedium and Viro during the lifetime of Athanasius, and many more such monasteries in subsequent decades, would suggest that Athanasius' model of Lavra-style monasticism had won out over the traditional mode of the eremitic life. Yet the debate over the most meritorious form of monastic life did not cease with Athanasius' death around the year 1000. For just as a triumph of communal monasticism on the Holy Mountain appeared to have been achieved, a championing of the eremitic life emerged in the form of the invention and spread of the legend of Athos' first monk, Peter the Athonite. So while I mentioned Peter the Athonite in passing at the beginning of this presentation, his relevance to our topic today, namely the relationship between Athanasius the Athonite and communal monasticism, does not become relevant until towards the end of Athanasius' life, and in particular after his death. The life of Peter the Athonite is attested in manuscripts starting in the 11th century, while the text itself was perhaps written in the period 980 to 1050. We don't know for certain. At the start, it is important to emphasize that the story of Peter, as recounted in the Vita, is legendary, and it's in fact a composite of different materials, including a miracle collection of St. Nicholas, which is the first part of the life, as well as the stories of 2 or possibly even 3 Peters. So it's a rather complex text, that is to say. And I'll just give a very brief recapitulation of the life, and then move on to passages that deal with this debate. So, according to Peter's Vita, Peter had promised to become a monk as a young man, but this promise had remained unfulfilled. While serving in the Byzantine army, Peter's a scholarius, sort of an elite soldier, Peter was captured by the Arabs and brought to the Syrian city of Samara. There he remained a prisoner until his intercessions to both St. Nicholas and St. Theodore freed him from his bondage on the condition that he finally made good on his promise to become a monk and journey to Rome. This Peter did, and he was even tonsured in the Eternal City by the Pope, who also instructed his new monk in spiritual matters. Peter then departed Rome on a boat, and through divine intervention, Peter was eventually cast off by the crew at Athos, where he would spend the last 53 years of his life. By the way, this Roman connection in Peter's life is very interesting, and it's something that we find in other Athonite fathers as well. So Blaise of Amorian, who was probably mentioned yesterday, also spent a good amount of time in Rome. So to this point in the text, it has nothing to say, the hagiographer has nothing to say about the comparative benefits of the monastic life. But the part of the life from this point onwards, so from Peter's arrival on Athos, now really focuses on Peter's ascetic feats, and in ways none too subtle, champions the eremitic life over cenobitic monasticism. And this is done through the narration of Peter's encounters with 4 demons, or 4 encounters with demons, let's say. Very standard part of hagiography. We find it in this life as well. So the demons are basically, what they're trying to do, they're trying to make Peter leave his hermitage, leave his cave. Again, this is something that we already find in the life of Anthony in the 4th century. This is something that demons try to do. They try to make you leave the place where you're supposed to be and go back into the world. So initially the demons tried to throw rocks and missiles in his cave in order to draw Peter out. And then in a second attempt, they sent all the snakes and beasts on Mount Athos into his abode. And that didn't work either. And so for the 3rd attempt, the demons try something more clever. A demon appears to Peter in the guise of a child of one of his household servants, so from Peter's, from his estate back home. And this child basically says, oh, you've been gone for so long, we've been praying about you, we wanted to find you, and here you are. And St. Nicholas has revealed to me where you are, and now you should come back home. And the demon, in the guise of the child, then tries to lure him back with the following reasoning. Peter's basically saying he should stay in his hermitage, and the demon responds with this passage. This is the first quotation. But tell me truthfully, which of the 2 ways of monastic life is especially pleasing to God? To withdraw from the world, both in solitude and peace, with a life spent amongst the deep rocks and ravines, in which you benefit yourself alone, or perhaps not even yourself, or in the teaching of men and guidance, and turning from deceit to Him, God. I myself know that the turning of a single soul from the very road of deceit surpasses the labors of many hermits. So he's basically saying here, it's much better that you go into the world and preach and sort of share your spiritual gifts, rather than remaining here in nature where nobody's going to hear you. That's the demon's argumentation. So that is his argumentation, but Peter says he's going to stay here until the Theotokos allows him to leave, and this is also a part of the life. Every time he says Theotokos, the demon has to disappear, because the demon can't stand to hear the name of the Mother of God. But then the demon returns a 4th time and tries another strategy. He returns now as in the guise of an archangel, and he again says that you should leave right away. And he says, this is the second quotation, that Peter should depart to the monasteries in the world, and there I will be with you, and I will aid many through you, says the Almighty. And then, again, the demon doesn't succeed, and we go to sort of the end of the life. So Peter, I'm not going to go through all the details, but Peter passes away. Before he dies, he's visited by a hunter. The hunter promises to return, but when the hunter comes back to Athos, Peter's already died, but his body's perfectly preserved, and then he's venerated as a saint, and that's sort of how his legend is born. At the end of the text, we have this very interesting passage where the hagiographer himself speaks, and the hagiographer's name is Nicholas, and he's writing on Athos. He seems to be connected with Iviro Monastery, and he writes the following. This is the third quotation. They lapse and are remiss, I think, who think this great thing alone, to break away from the world and worldly things. So he's talking about monks. But that they can do the rest with impunity, that is, possessing many costly objects, money, fields, goods, and more, which are highly sought after from those who love the world and its cares. Yet they do not provide any use to themselves. They also cause tremendous damage to those who listen to them and see them, and causes the name of God to be blasphemed through them, since they are said to be very rich instead of poor, masters of earthly wealth and strangers to celestial riches. So this Peter of Athos is, at least in my interpretation, a polemic against worldly conopia. Peter retains his ascetic virtue by resisting the pleas of the demons to leave his cave and become a monk of the world, and presumably become one of those rich monks with the Vita's author Nicholas so despised. In short, Peter's legend can be read as a reaction of some parties on the Holy Mountain who were upset by the success of the great communal monasteries, like the Great Lavra. And Peter's idealization did not stop there, because his life is reworked in the 14th century by Gregory Palamas, which is a very popular text. And in general, actually Peter is a very oft-depicted saint in sort of Athonite art, in frescoes and what have you. More so than Athanasios, in fact. So, to conclude, the allure of the simplicity and the tranquility of the hermit's life can be beguiling, even capturing the imagination of figures like Lord Byron, as I tried to show on the quotation at the beginning of this presentation. Though Athanasios had tried to reconcile the various forms of monastic life with his Lavra, satisfying all the proponents of eremitic and communal monasticism was an impossible task. Nonetheless, perhaps Athanasius' hagiographer said it best when he remarked, quote, "The great Savos was celebrated as one who settled and adorned the monastic desert. But did not his shepherd, Athanasius, acquire a populous flock? Did he not fill Athos with many monastic complexes? Did not this man also have the gift of discernment and dispensation, like those celebrated of old for this? Just as with Pachomius, did not God also appoint this man from heaven above? Just as with Anthony, he not only promised to make him famous, but actually made him so, conveying the report of his virtue even to emperors." So I think it's very conspicuous in this quotation at the end of the life of Athanasius that the hagiographer actually mentions the three principal proponents of these three forms of monastic life. So we have Savos for the Lavra, we have Anthony as the hermit, and we have Pachomius for the communal life. And I think we can agree that Athanasius' great achievement was actually his synthesis of these three traditions that ensured that communal monasticism, whatever its wealth and power, would never succeed in blotting out the other two strands of monastic life, as for instance happened to a greater or lesser degree in the medieval West. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you might have.
So we have some time for questions. Thank you so much for a very interesting, very stimulating, talk. And have we any questions? Yes.
What is the date of the life of Peter that you were quoting? Because Gregory Palamas also wrote a life of Peter,
14th century.
and it would seem from what you say that this debate about the best nature of monasticism didn't finish here but continued right through to the 14th century at least.
Yes, thank you very much for this question, Norman Russell. Yes, I know Palamas is a shorter version of the life as well. So the date of the life, we don't know. The guess is probably 980 to 1050. The first manuscripts of Peter's life come from the 11th century, but it is an extremely popular text, so we have many manuscripts of it, dozens of manuscripts. I would have to look and see how many. And Peter in general is, as you say, he's venerated later to a great degree, and this can be seen as a continuation of this debate about communal monasticism and the relative merits of communal and eremitic monasticism. I didn't have time to talk, I'll maybe do this in the written version. In later centuries, including in the Ottoman period, Athanasius is actually invoked a lot in this debate about idiorhythmia, so the sort of irregular monasticism that takes hold on Athos, especially in the 16th century later. And when the Patriarch of Constantinople tries to restore communal monasticism, he basically references Athanasius a lot and says, Athanasius wanted communal monasticism in the Lavra and elsewhere on Athos, therefore we have to return to it. We can't have this idiorhythmia. But it's an ongoing debate. I think it never ends, actually. And even today, you can talk about the relative merits of the different forms of monastic life.
Another question?
Zygu is, as I'm sure you know, under intensive restoration, and it seems to have quite a lot of material assets, dealing with olives and all that stuff. So it seems to be quite a sort of materialistic institution. I guess you could, I don't know whether reconstruction is going to be complete, but I guess you could set that be quite helpful.
Yes, the question is about this monastic institution, Zigu, which is a monastery that Athanasius visits when he first comes to Athos, and it's just outside the boundaries of the present-day monastic republic on sort of the northwestern border of Athos. And the question was actually that these archaeological excavations are ongoing. They're doing a very nice job, actually. And it looks like it was a very comfortable place. And yes, I would completely agree with that. I don't remember everything off the top of my head, but there are displays around the excavation. And there's definitely, I believe, a wine press, an olive press. There's a bakery. So it's a major institution. And just to give a little bit of context to Zigu, the reason that it survives is it was basically abandoned in the 13th century. So it was an Athonite, or sort of on the periphery of Athos up to that point, but then it was abandoned, and in this way was able to be preserved because it wasn't reused after that. And yeah, these excavations are very important. But yes, thank you for your question.
Yes.
Could I just make a point about the monastery of Zigu? The life that you've been quoting from, and indeed I quoted a lot from yesterday because of its English translation, it's easy to get to, was actually the last of the three lives that was written.
Yeah.
It was possibly written as late as the 12th century, we don't know.
Yeah.
But in the earlier life, that we refer to as the Peter Pair, Athanasius is reported to go to the ridge of Zigu, not to the monastery, to the ridge. And the ridge is more or less, as you so rightly pointed out, the boundary of Athos. And it's referred to in the documents that establish that boundary. To talk about Zigu's ridge. So I think there is some doubt about where exactly Athanasius went. If he went just to a place, the ridge, and lived an eremitic life there, that's fine. Rocks, mountains, caves, and so on and so forth. But I think by the time the author of the second life is writing, the monastery of Zigos was there. So he's altered things a little bit. So fascinating that this site is, and I haven't visited it, and I'm dying to visit it. It may in fact be on the site of an earlier Christian establishment,
Yeah.
because I think, if I might remember something, reports of the archaeological excavation, they found some much earlier remains there. So it may well have been a Christian institution of some sort, but it may not have been where Athanasius initially went. So we're in one of these fascinating areas of doubt. Don't know.
Summarize that.
Yes, I'll try to briefly summarize that. So basically, Rosemary Morris asked a question about the Zigu Monastery, and the example I gave, and she gave as well yesterday, we're drawing from the third version of this life of Athanasius. So, and it's actually the latest. So this is Vita B. There's a Vita A, which is earlier than Vita B. There's Vita B, and then there's also a Vita C, which I didn't talk about at all, but it's rather fragmentary. It doesn't go very far. Vita C is actually supposedly the earliest life. Yes, I think with, and in Vita A, it doesn't mention a monastery at Zigu, but rather only the rich at Zigu. And so the question is, maybe what was there? Is this some sort of, is the hagiographer of Vita B maybe projecting the present, how the monastery looked when he lived onto Athanasius' time? I think that's quite likely. And I think that applies to a lot of the things in a lot of details in Vita B. For instance, when the hagiographer is describing the construction of the Great Lavra, and he's mentioning that as soon as Athanasius comes back from Crete, he immediately builds an enormous refectory with room for, I think, 120 monks, a bathhouse, a hospital, an aqueduct. None of this makes sense if the plan is just to have a church and 5 monks, including Athanasius and Nicephorus. So I think here as well, the hagiographer is projecting the way the Lavra looked in his own day back to Athanasius' time. And this isn't, by the way, this isn't deliberate fabrication, I think, because usually what hagiographers are doing, they're writing about the stories of these saints, but they have to be plausible to the audiences that are reading them in their own time. So you want to include details like that to sort of say, well, the saint had already sort of planned how, say, that Zigu would be there or that Lavra would look like it does today. And I think a lot of this, in German we have this wonderful word, Quellenkritik, so the criticism of sources and sort of going through the sources and see what makes sense, what doesn't make sense. We still have a lot of that to do, actually, with these Athonite lives. Not only with Athanasius' life, but this Peter Athos life as well.
Yes.
Thank you for your paper. Well, concerning this German idea of criticism of sources, what can be the idea or the motivation behind the idealization of Athanasius in hagiographical sources? Because considering the reconstruction of historical reality, his career obviously originated in the Byzantine elites. He was mentored or tutored by a very prominent Byzantine general. He had a spiritual mentor, and most probably he has been sort of commissioned to establish communal monasticism on Mount Athos, and he faced severe opposition by the established circles of hermit communities, and in a way he implemented the Palestinian model of Lavra communities as a compromise in order to probably conciliate to this opposition. But in his Vita, he is depicted like the pure inventor of communal monasticism, like he did so on his own. But most probably he was implementing imperial program or promoting the commission of his political mentor in the first place.
Yes, so thank you for this question. Rather a complex question. I think the idea is what is the agenda, basically, of the hagiographers in writing the legend of Athanasius the way that we read it in the Vita. So as you say, Athanasius, he has a very complex legacy, and it's complicated by the fact that his main patron is murdered, is assassinated, right? So, I mean, the way I would read what the various versions of Athanasius' life tell us, this idea that he was the person who brought communal monasticism to Mount Athos. That's not, I mean, as we know from the sources, that's not completely true. I think the hagiographers probably also recognized that there were other sort of monasteries on Athos before he came. But in a way, it's a way to, it's a better way to establish a grand narrative. It's easier to say one person came and changed everything. And it's easier to explain how monasticism changed on Athos. And I would also sort of strengthen, I think, Lavra's claim to being a transformative institution, which it was, of course, in its own way. And we see this also, by the way, with the hagiography from the Egyptian desert at the beginnings of Christian monasticism. Scholars now know Anthony was not the only ascetic wandering around the desert. He's the one who had a great biographer, basically, and he gets credited with inventing communal eremitic monasticism. And with Pachomius as well, I mean, he probably wasn't the only monk who was experimenting with these communal forms. But again, I think hagiographers and scholars too, I mean, to a degree, it's easier to follow sort of the grand narrative. One person does it, changes everything, and I think maybe that's just sort of a human tendency in some ways, right? That's the way I read it. Maybe that's too simple reading, but.
Yes, thank you very much. It was fascinating. I'm a bit confused about essentially this argument between possessors and non-possessors, to use an acronistic terminology, and the role of Nikephoros, because it sounds as if what he's inveighing against is very much like at the same time as building up Athanasios' monastery, and other people are describing that in just the terms that he's criticizing, but also the idea of not giving monasteries lands. I mean, presumably this means more extensive lands. It isn't preventing them being self-sufficient in basics. Yes, yeah, because I was thinking that having to trade for their basic foodstuffs would probably be much more distracting than being self-sufficient, but the lands refers to sort of excessive, yeah.
So yes, you bring up something very interesting in your question, and just to sort of give the context, you're talking about the debate between so-called possessors and non-possessors, which is a debate that unfolds in 16th century Muscovy. So we're talking about early modern, late medieval Russian monasticism. And they're also basically there's one party that claims that the best form of monastic life is not to have extensive landed estates and to sort of live a poor, idealized form of the monastic life. And there's another monastic, those are the non-possessors. And the possessors are saying, actually, it's quite okay for monasteries to have a lot of land. They do good things, they do charitable activities, they pray for the dead, they need these lands for good purposes. This debate is really interesting with regard to Athos, actually, and somebody should write more about it who is more sort of initiated into the Russian tradition. But there's an Athonite involved in this controversy, Maxim Grek, so Maximus the Greek. So he's sort of propagating this non-possessor view. And interestingly, both sides invoke Athanasius. So they can use Athanasius to say, well, look at the Lavra today, it has all of these estates. Athanasius obviously wanted economically powerful monastic institutions. But then you can read these other passages from Athanasius' life and say, well, he was actually a proponent of the Lavra, which is to be a poor monastery, not to have land. And he's used on both sides of the debate. So I think that gives you an idea of the complexity of his reception in later centuries. And also the complexity around his own monastic views, because scholars are still arguing about this. Did he have a conversion experience? Was he a proponent of eremitic monasticism who changed his mind later as it being impractical? You can argue both ways, and that happens exactly in the mid-16th century, especially the Stoglav, this 100 chapter synod in Moscow in the 1550s. Thank you.
One more question, perhaps? Yes.
Thank you. Are there, in terms of sources, also any monumental script on rocks and caves or places where there were skeets or cells or hermitages that also contribute to the source material of what was happening at the time, as we were referring to the beta A, B, C, which is in written form, in these areas that you've researched?
Thank you. Yes, this is a great question, and it's about, the question is basically, do the sources we have about Mount Athos, do they come exclusively from the Kenovia, from the great communal monasteries, or do we also have written material or material of other types from the hermitages or the skeets or something like that? And the short answer is, for the medieval period, it's only things that have survived in the Kenovia, basically. And we do have individual documents from hermitages, but only because that hermitage had something to do with a larger monastery. So, for instance, it gets bought by a larger monastery, or the owner dies and it gets inherited, taken over by a larger monastery. So that's the only way that we have documents from these hermitages. When we get to the early modern period, especially in the more important skeets, so these sort of not at the same level as a large monastery, but sort of smaller monastic institutions, they have their own archives that can be used for, say, the Ottoman period, the period of Ottoman rule in Athos. But unfortunately for the medieval period, I would say, only if it happened to be taken up, put into a Kenovia's archive. Kenovia's archive does it. Do we have that sort of material? Unfortunately.
Time for a bonus question.
Okay, this is another subject altogether, and that's a big subject. At the end of your talk, you said his legacy was a synthesis of three traditions. And then you said that this didn't happen in Western monasticism.
Yes.
So this is also the height of Cluniac monasticism, which I know, Benedictine monasticism, Cistercian. Can I ask what you meant by this didn't happen in the West? I know it's a very big question, but it's important because we're dialogue between the East and maybe the West.
Yes, like Athanasius, I'm confused sometimes about what form of monasticism I want to champion. But basically this idea that my basic contention is that in the East, in the Byzantine world, we have this richness of forms of monastic life. Today on Athos as well. You go to Athos, you see hermits, you see the skeets, so the mid-level monasteries, you see the great Kenovia. In the West, what happens, the traditional narrative, is that with the rise of the Benedictine rule and other sort of communal rules, the rule of the master, so on and so forth, the other forms of monasticism that you have in the late antique world are sort of pushed out and abolished. That doesn't mean that they completely don't exist anymore, because you can have, say, in Trappist monasteries or in certain monastic forms in the West, you can have an element for sort of eremitic practice or anchoritic, living as an anchorite. But you don't have the same variety as you have in the East. So I would say the East, the Byzantine world, you have this synthesis or this variety of monastic life. In the West, it's really after the early Middle Ages, it's really about the great communal monasteries. Monte Cassino. The reason I came late to the conference, actually, I was at another conference on Reichenau Island, where you have a monastery that was founded 1,300 years ago, also a great communal monastery, St. Gallen, so on and so forth. So in the West, you have these communal monasteries, and eremitic and sort of these mixed forms of life can only exist within a sort of communal framework. And in Byzantium, you do have these different forms. That would be my basic conviction. Not all medievalists would agree with it, but yes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for such an illuminating, interesting, stimulating talk. We much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.